The Mafia boss waited alone every Christmas, until a single dad and his daughter knocked on his door with cookies. Every Christmas Eve, Don Julian Valerius did the same thing. He stood by the tall, bulletproof window in his study, a tumbler of aged scotch in his hand, staring out at the quiet snowfall that suffocated the town of Blackwood, Colorado. The scene outside looked deceptively peaceful, like something from a postcard. Warm lights glowed from distant houses, smoke curling from chimneys. But up here, on the peak of the mountain where his stone fortress was perched, the silence was a weapon. Julian's house was vast, a monument of dark wood, cold marble, and shadowy corridors, every surface gleaming with a sterile perfection. The towering fir in the corner was decorated with ornaments of silver and black, elegant but devoid of warmth. No presence sat beneath it. The cavernous fireplace was a dark, cold mouth. The only sound came from the deliberate ticking of a grandfather clock, a sound as steady and unforgiving as his own heartbeat. He stood still, his reflection a sharp silhouette in the glass before him, clad in a perfectly tailored black Mafia suit. The snow outside fell in thick, soft flakes, swirling in the glow of the high-powered security lamps at the end of the long, winding driveway. Somewhere far down the mountain, someone laughed, the sound instantly swallowed by the night. A dog barked. He had everything a man in his position could desire: power, fear, respect, a name that made men tremble in boardrooms and back alleys alike. In town, however, he was simply the shadow on the mountain, the man who lived alone in the imposing house that loomed over their lives. He did not attend their festivals. He never mingled. He was a ghost in expensive Italian leather. And yet, every year on this night, he found himself here by the window waiting. For what, exactly? He could never articulate it. A rival, a ghost from his past, or maybe just a sound to break the crushing silence. He took a small sip of the scotch, the burn of familiar comfort. Every detail of the evening was a ritual of emptiness. The untouched dinner on the stove, prepared by a staff that was never seen. The single strand of cold, white lights on the tree that never blinked. All of it was heavy with memory, with loss. Snow piled higher on the windowsill as the night deepened. Julian glanced at the clock. Almost 9 p.m. Another Christmas Eve nearly gone, just like the last and the one before that. Still, he stayed by the window. Still, he watched. The cold weight in his soul was constant, not sharp, just ever-present. And then it came. A sound, faint but unmistakable. 3 short, hesitant knocks on the massive front door. Julian turned sharply, his body instantly tense. He stood frozen for a second. No one ever knocked on his door uninvited. Certainly not on Christmas Eve. Another pause. Then the knock came again, a little louder, followed by the crunch of snow beneath small feet. He moved toward the door slowly, his steps silent across the marble floor, his hand instinctively brushing the side of his jacket. At the entryway, he hesitated, his eyes on the security feed before placing his hand on the heavy, cold handle. When he opened the door, the winter air rushed in, stark and fresh. And there on his front steps stood a man with soft brown hair and weary eyes, a worn scarf pulled tightly around his neck. Beside him, a little girl in a bright red dress and white mittens held up a small box wrapped in gold paper, her cheeks flushed from the cold. They both looked up at him, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The girl smiled shyly. The man opened his mouth to speak. Julian said nothing. He simply stared. They stood together on the porch, 3 strangers in the soft hush of Christmas night, snow swirling gently around them as the distant church bells began to ring. The man offered a small, nervous smile. "Hi," he said, his voice quiet. "I hope we're not interrupting anything." Julian stood in the doorway, a formidable, unreadable presence. The little girl beside her father tilted her head and held up the small box. "We brought cookies," she said brightly. "We're giving them to our new neighbors." The man gave a quiet laugh, though his eyes darted nervously around the imposing entryway. "She insisted we deliver them tonight. Said Christmas cookies taste better when they're shared." Julian looked from the girl to the man. Something about their fragile presence on his doorstep felt completely out of place, and yet, it pulled at something dormant within him. "I see," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "We just moved in," the man continued, gesturing vaguely down the mountain. The little cottage with the blue shutters. He extended a gloved hand, then seemed to think better of it, letting it fall to his side. "I'm Croft, and this is my daughter Cora." The girl gave a small wave. Julian realized he had been standing silent for too long, assessing them. He cleared his throat and stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" he asked. The words felt foreign on his tongue. Reese's brows raised slightly. "Are you sure?" Julian gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's cold." Reese smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes for the first time. "Thank you." He guided Cora inside, brushing snow from their coats. As Julian closed the heavy door, the sound echoing like a vault ceiling shut, something shifted. The silence in the house, once oppressive, felt different, punctuated by the small sounds of his guests. Cora looked around wide-eyed, taking in the soaring ceilings, the shadowed corners, and the intimidating tree. "Wow," she whispered. "It looks like a castle." "It's just a house," Julian said softly. "But it's really, really quiet," she added, her small voice seeming to get lost in the sheer scale of the space. They followed Julian into a vast, state-of-the-art kitchen. Reese placed the cookie box on a granite island while Cora wandered over to inspect the towering, stainless steel refrigerators. "I hope you like chocolate chip," Reese said. Cora giggled. "I tried to help." Julian found himself giving a small, dry chuckle. The sound surprised even him. "I'm sure they're fine." Suddenly, Cora sniffed the air, and her eyes widened. "Is that hot chocolate?" she asked. Julian turned. He had forgotten the pot his housekeeper had left warming. He moved to switch off the heat. "It is," he said. "Would you like some?" "Yes, please," Cora said, bouncing slightly. He reached for mugs, his hand pausing before he moved to a different cabinet. He pulled out a pair of old ceramic cups, ivory with faded blue trim, wiping the dust from their rims before pouring the cocoa. He handed one mug to Cora, the other to Reese. He accepted it with a grateful glance. "This is really good," Cora said after a sip. "We've been bringing cookies to every house we can," she explained, swinging her legs under the tall stool. "Dad says it's our family tradition. Even if it's just us, it's something we started a few years ago," Reese added quietly. "To teach her that giving is what makes the season feel like Christmas." Julian said nothing. He just watched Cora sip cocoa from a mug that hadn't been touched in a decade. There was something about her unvarnished joy, that reached into places his power and wealth never could. And for the first time in a very long time, Julian didn't feel like a phantom in his own fortress. The kitchen carried the same cold perfection that defined the rest of the house. But tonight, a slightly cracked tray of homemade cookies sat at the center of the granite island. They gathered around it, an unlikely trio in the cavernous room. Outside, snow fell in a hush, blanketing the mountain in white. Cora's eyes wandered to the small, artificial Christmas tree in the corner, bare except for a stark, silver star at the top. "Why is your tree sad, Mr. Julian?" she asked. Julian blinked.
"Sad."
She nodded. "It looks like it has no one to play with." Reese chuckled softly, a nervous sound. But Julian, caught off guard, let out a dry, genuine smile. "Well," he said, his voice softer than before, "it's been living alone for a while. I guess it got used to it." That answer seemed to satisfy her. As Reese and Julian made small talk about the town, Cora quietly slipped from her stool. She tiptoed to the tree, untied the red satin bow from her brown hair, and carefully fastened it to one of the top branches. Then she pulled a handful of brightly wrapped candies from her coat pocket and hung them across the lower branches. Finally, she tugged gently at the hem of her dress, unthreaded a thin piece of white lace from the trim, and draped it like a garland around the middle. "There," she announced, stepping back. "Now it has friends." Julian turned, startled. The little tree, once forgotten, now sparkled softly, clothed not in polished ornaments, but in the offerings of a little girl. Reese stood beside him, covering his mouth, his eyes glassy. Julian walked over. He knelt beside Cora and gently adjusted the bough. "I think," he said softly, "this might be the happiest the tree has ever been." Cora beamed. Reese looked at Julian, not as the intimidating figure on the mountain, but as someone who had quietly opened his world to something fragile and real. Later, as the clock neared 10, Reese bundled Cora into her coat and gloves. "Thank you for having us," Reese said. "Thank you for coming," Julian replied. Just as Reese reached for the door, Cora darted back. She threw her arms around Julian's waist and squeezed. Then she leaned up on tiptoes and whispered, "I left my bough on the tree, so tomorrow it won't look lonely." Julian stood still as she skipped back to her father's side. He watched them walk into the snow, their figures slowly fading down the hill. Inside, the mugs remained on the counter. The air still held the warmth of their presence. And across the room on the once-forgotten tree, the soft red bough stood out against the stark silver and black. It was the first thing someone had left behind in his home in years. The snow did not melt for weeks. The town remained blanketed in white, but for Julian Valerius, something had changed. His routine shifted. It began with drives down Main Street, his tinted windows gliding past the small bookstore where Reese worked part-time. The first time he stopped in, Reese looked startled. He bought a classic novel, thanked him, and left. The next day he returned. Cora was there, sitting behind the counter with a coloring book. When she saw him, her face lit up. "Mr. Jules," she called. The nickname stuck. Soon, Julian came in daily. He and Cora developed an effortless bond. She invited him to the winter craft fair. He showed up, looking out of place in his expensive coat, holding cider and pretending not to smile. At the library's holiday story hour, he sat beside her, reading aloud in a low, rumbling voice that captivated the children. "Mr. Jules reads funny," she whispered to Reese later. "I like it still." Something unspoken and cautious hovered between Julian and Reese. Their connection was warm but edged with the reality of who Julian was. Then one day, Julian cleared his throat and asked, "If you're free, maybe you and Cora would like to come over for dinner." Reese raised a brow. "Are you cooking?" Julian smiled, a rare, almost sheepish expression. Attempting to, Reese glanced at Cora, who squealed, "Yes." That Friday evening, Julian's home looked different. The tree in the corner still wore Cora's candies and red bough. Reese arrived carrying Cora's backpack and a bottle of wine. He stopped short as a warm, spiced scent reached him. "Is that cinnamon?" he asked. Julian appeared, an apron over his dark sweater. "I hope I didn't ruin it." He led them to the dining table where 3 plates were set. In the center was a tray of apple tarts. Reese stared, his eyes wide. "I mentioned these once," he murmured. "My mother used to make them. I haven't tasted them in years." Julian gave a small shrug, not quite meeting his eyes. "You said they were your favorite." Reese stood frozen, touched beyond words. He placed the wine on the counter, stepped forward, and wrapped his arms around Julian. It was not romance, not yet, but it was something deeper. When he pulled back, his voice trembled. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," Julian said. In the kitchen, Cora was already humming a Christmas tune, licking cinnamon from her fingers. It was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to name. Something that, for the first time in a very long time, felt a little bit like home. One night, after Cora had fallen asleep on the rug, Reese looked toward Julian. "She adores you," he said softly. Julian smiled faintly. "I adore her, too." The peace between them invited truth. "You're good with her," Reese said. "You listen." Julian's gaze drifted to the cold fireplace. "I think it's because," he said quietly, "I always thought I'd be a father." Reese turned, his eyes softening. "My fiancée was 6 months pregnant when she died," Julian said, his voice flat. "It wasn't an accident. It was a message from a rival family." The words came without decoration, just the stripped, brutal truth. They didn't save the baby. A boy. After that, I worked. That's all I did. I built this empire on their memory. Reese crossed the room and sat across from him. That's not who you are now, Julian looked at him. Maybe not anymore, Reese hesitated, then spoke. Cora's other father, he left because he was in trouble. The kind of trouble that gets people hurt. I took her and ran. I haven't seen him since. Their eyes met, holding steady. There was no pity, only a grim understanding. Two men who had lost differently but deeply. Eventually, Reese rose, gathered his sleeping daughter, and thanked him. When the door closed, Julian's gaze fell on the cookie box from that first night. He reached for it slowly, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not sugar or flour, but connection. The tears surprised him. They came softly at first, then faster. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking in the silence, crying for the boy who never was, for the woman he lost, and for the miraculous chance that life was offering him one more try. It began with a knock at Reese's door. Not Julian's this time, his. He opened it to find a man standing on his porch, a cruel smirk on his face that made Reese's blood run cold. "Reese," he said, "we need to talk." It was Marco, Cora's biological father, a man tied to the very life Reese had fled. He wasn't just here to talk. By the end of the week, Reese received a letter from an attorney. Marco had filed for partial custody. He had moved to Colorado and claimed he was ready to be a father. Reese sat on the floor, the letter trembling in his hands. He couldn't afford a lawyer. Worse, Marco had connections, money, and no morals. He could spin any story he wanted. When he told Julian, his voice was barely a whisper. Julian listened without interruption, then set his mug down. "Do you want me to help?" Reese hesitated. "This isn't your fight." Julian stepped closer. "Reese," he said quietly, "I am not doing this because I feel obligated. I am doing this because you and Cora deserve someone to stand beside you. You do not have to carry this alone." Within 2 days, Julian had his own people looking into Marco. There would be no courtroom. The meeting took place in a secluded warehouse on the edge of town. Marco leaned confidently against a stack of crates, flanked by 2 large men. Julian walked in alone, his suit immaculate, his face unreadable. "She's my daughter, Valerius," Marco sneered. "The law is on my side." Julian stopped a few feet from him, his voice calm and cold. "I have known Reese Croft and his daughter for several months. In that time, I have watched him raise a child with more love, grace, and strength than most people could imagine. Cora is happy, well cared for, and deeply loved. She is thriving because of her father." Marco's lawyer tried to interject, but Julian held his gaze. "I am not family," he said, "but I care deeply about them. And if this is about ensuring Cora has a stable, safe life, I will offer everything I have to ensure it." Then he turned slightly, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that filled the cavernous space. "If what Cora needs is a father figure, if she needs someone who will be there day after day, then I am ready. Not because I want to replace anyone." He looked directly at Marco, a silent promise of violence in his eyes. "But because I will never walk away. Leave, now, and never come back, or you will disappear, and no one will ever look for you." Silence fell. Marco, for the first time, looked afraid. He and his men were gone before the sun rose the next day. 1 year later, the house at the end of Pine Hollow Road was different. Inside, the once cold walls echoed with laughter. Wrapping paper littered the floor, and the sweet scent of freshly baked cookies hung in the air. "I am being careful," Cora shouted from the table, her face dusted with flour, a red apron tied over her dress. "This one is for Mr. Jules." Julian entered the room, brushing snow from his coat. He paused in the doorway, a genuine smile on his face. "Hey," he said, "what masterpiece are we creating?" Cora grinned and held up a green-smeared cookie. "It's perfect," he said, kneeling beside her. Reese handed him a warm mug of cider, brushing flour from his shoulder. "Welcome home," he said. He looked at Reese then, his hair pulled up in a loose bun, sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from the oven's heat. This was the version of him he loved most. Though neither of them had said the words, everyone in town knew. And when the judge finalized the paperwork 2 months ago, officially approving Julian's adoption of Cora as her legal guardian, no one questioned it. He had already been showing up for her every day. Now the living room was scattered with toys. The once bare tree overflowed with mismatched ornaments, most made by Cora's hands. One still held the red bough she had left behind that very first night. As dusk settled, Julian opened the front door. "Where are you going?" Reese asked. He turned and grinned. "Just checking what it feels like when the doors open." He looked back at Reese and Cora, glowing in the kitchen light. "Turns out," he added, "it feels a lot like home." The Christmas tree this year was nearly twice as tall, its twinkling star brushing the ceiling. The three of them stood together, bathed in the soft glow of the tree and the crackling fire. Snow fell gently outside. Cora leaned against Julian's side, her hand in his. Reese slipped his hand into Julian's free one. "You saved us," he whispered. But Julian shook his head, tightening his fingers around his. "No," he said. "You too saved me. I didn't know what a family was supposed to feel like until I opened that door and found you both standing there." He knelt so he was eye to eye with Cora. "From now on," he told her, "every Christmas, I'll be the one knocking on the door first." Cora's face lit up. She kissed his cheek, then carefully picked up the tray of cookies. "Time to knock," she declared proudly. Julian opened the front door. The world outside was hushed and glowing. The little girl in the red dress stepped onto the porch, holding the tray steady. Then, with a giggle, she turned and knocked gently on their own door. Across the street, a moving truck was parked. The porch light flicked on as Cora called out, "Cookies for the new neighbors." Inside, the warmth of home followed them. Reese, Julian, and Cora stood arm in arm under the porch light as the snow continued to fall. The church bells rang out for midnight, for Christmas Day. Julian looked down at the two people beside him, their laughter, their light, their love, and felt a peace he once believed was lost forever. They stepped back into the house, leaving the door open behind them, the sound of 3 hearts beating in rhythm.